Hello there. Today I'm rounding out my look at some of the wines from Weingut Brundlmayer in Kamptal with a tasting of their Zweigelt 2020. This is a wine labelled as a Niederosterreich wine. And just briefly to recap on Brundlmayer, historic producer based in the town of Langenlois. Langenlois is at the confluence of the Danube and the Kamp River, so in the Kamptal wine region. It's a historic estate tracing its origins back to 1581. It's a fair sized estate, it's 80 hectares of vineyards, and the quality of those vineyards is very high. So they have holdings in quite a large number of Österländer. I mean, Ried Lamb, Ried Heiligenstein, Ried Kaufenberg, and several more of these prestigious vineyards. So the quality of their vineyards is very good, and also their approach has a very contemporary feel. Willy Brundlmayer took over the running of the estate back in 1980, which was quite a dark time for the Austrian wine industry. And he's moved their production to being entirely certified as organic. Their approach is sustainable and everything they do is ecologically friendly. And as a result, I think today the wines of Weingut Brundlmayer are seen as certainly some of Kamptal's best wine and arguably some of Austria's best wines. In general, they tend to be age-worthy. I've talked about the Österlager vineyards they own that all come under the Kamptal DAC. But that is only for their white wines, and in fact, roughly 30% of the estate's production is actually red wine. So that's quite important for them, but they can only label that as coming from Niederosterreich because the Kamptal DAC is only allowed for certain white grape varieties. The reds they make include St. Laurent, Pinot Noir, Zweigelt, as we can see, but also they've experimented with later ripening varieties such as, for instance, Cabernet Sauvignon. One of the things that Willy Brundlmayer did was to purchase the cellars and some of the vineyards from the Zweigelt family, and it's those vines that this and their reserve Zweigelt come from. Zweigelt is an Austrian developed crossing, developed by, not surprisingly, by Dr Zweigelt. He originally wanted to call it Rotberger. Now, the crossing was created, I believe, in the 1920s, but it wasn't actually until about 1970 that the argument over the variety's naming with the other variety that had a counterclaim, and they settled on Zweigelt as the name for this variety. So I think we can probably say that having come from the family who developed the crossing, these vineyards have impeccable pedigree for Zweigelt. It's highly likely they contain some of the older Zweigelt vines in existence. Zweigelt is a crossing between two popular Austrian grown grape varieties, Blaufränkisch and St. Laurent. Evidently St. Laurent is related to Pinot Noir, so the wine tends to have quite a soft, fruity, not too structured tendency that's given a little bit more weight by the character that's come from the Blaufränkisch in the crossing. Now, the 2020 vintage started off with a dry, warm winter. Spring was also dry, and it wasn't until mid-May that rain finally came. The vines revived and were able to catch up with flowering. The summer was mostly warm and quite humid, and that led to a large amount of vegetative growth, which required quite a lot of work in the vineyard. Now, 2020 wasn't the best time to need lots of workers in the vineyard because with the COVID-19 pandemic, there were restrictions and social distancing was in place, making vineyard management all the more difficult. Harvest was incredibly patchy. The crews had to take regular breaks as rain descended on the vineyards. However, particularly the earlier harvested varieties, this was picked in early October between the 3rd and the 7th, have tended to produce wines with quite bright, fresh flavours. Picking was by hand into small boxes, small cagettes. At the winery, fruit was destemmed and crushed, and then there was a prolonged period of skin contact that lasted 2 weeks. The must was gently pressed into stainless steel tanks, and there it started fermenting. The wine then matured for between 12 and 24 months in large Austrian oak casks, 2,400 litres each. So these would be seasoned casks. Austrian oak is a sessile oak, so like French oak, not quite as strong a flavour as American oak, and the large size of the casks all means that this is really more to stabilise the wine by allowing a slow exposure to oxygen rather than trying to put oak characteristics onto the wine. So let's see what it's like, shall I? Looking at this, you've got a quite darkly pigmented purple red, looking to have touches of CO2 around the rim. It's not particularly deep. I can see straight through it. I mean, it's probably medium depth of colour. Swirling it, this wine only has 12.5% alcohol according to its label. It's not particularly forming tears, but I am still seeing touches of CO2 at the edges there as I swirl. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall I? I've got this in quite a large glass. I wanted to make sure I was releasing the aromas here. The nose isn't particularly powerful, but there's a very sort of clean, rich, ripe red cherry. So quite simplistic, but very pure, juicy red fruit there. So let's taste. On the palate, that's fresh, it's dry. Initially, it's really quite light-bodied, but actually the wine starts to sort of show a little bit of structure on the palate, and there is enough tannin that would ensure that this would work really quite nicely with certain foods. The wine's at best medium-bodied. It's probably better to say light to medium. It's sort of really quite juicy and fresh on the mid-palate, and then actually, because it's only got 12.5% alcohol, the finish seems quite light by comparison, and that's just allowing this sort of delicate, smooth, juicy, fresh red fruit to show through on the finish. The wine is really quite straightforward. The fine structure that was giving just a little bit of grip at the beginning of the mid-palate fades to more of a sort of a smooth, velvety nature, and then gives way to the perfumed red fruit on the finish. The wine has reasonable intensity. It's quite straightforward, it's quite one-dimensional, but that one dimension has a lovely purity and a freshness to it. I think it's a wine you probably drink over the next couple of years and really enjoy. You wouldn't want to keep it for too long because its freshness will start to fade, and that's its main virtue. So a wine to drink up relatively quickly. Looking at its aggregated critics score on Wine Searcher, we don't actually have a score for this vintage, but the aggregation for all vintages of this comes in at 89. And I think given the wine's straightforward nature, I think 89 is a fair reflection of the quality that you see and the intensity of the fruit. But it's never a wine that's going to become particularly complex. It's not a wine that's going to age, so yes, 89 is a pretty good score there. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, do please press the like button. If you'd like to watch more of these, it would be fantastic if you could subscribe to our channel, and that way you can set yourself an alert so that you're notified every time we publish a new tasting, should you wish to see those. If you have any comments, please leave those in the comments box below. We would genuinely be interested to hear your reactions to the wines we're looking at, the tastings we're doing, or anything else that relates to them. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, it would be wonderful if you could pass it on to them. We'd very much appreciate that. I will leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this particular vintage of this wine, so that you can find out if it's available in your market, you can find out its pricing, who's stocking it, and then using the tabs on that page, you can also find out a little bit more about the background of the wine. You can see its price history, and you can see what critics' scores or notes we have available for it. So once again, thank you for watching, and I do hope you'll manage to make some time in the very near future to come and join us for another tasting. Until then, bye for now.